3, 2, 1.
What's up, everyone? Todd Brown, That Racing Show. Thanks for dropping by for this pit stop segment. NASCAR Consolation races. This was something that was brought up in the news this week because of a paint scheme. And we're going to talk about all of that here in just a little bit, as well as some other things. But first, I want to start out by talking about a few things that happened this week, in case you missed it. Now, to start out with, some good news for one driver out there this week. That was Erik Jones, who was cleared by NASCAR and his doctors to return to competition this week at Kansas. But the team and Erik himself said, you know what, let's chill out for another week. Let's take a little more time to get better. I think it was a great decision. Corey Haim going to be back behind the wheel this weekend in that 43 car. And the reason why I love this idea is because next week is Darlington. This is a track that Erik Jones is really good at. Got 2 victories there. And this comes first time in a Toyota, second time in a Chevrolet. Now he's back in the Toyota. Toyotas are always really strong at Darlington. So I think this is a great decision to do this. And I would not be surprised one bit to see Erik be right up there and be competitive for the win. I mean, come on. What better way to get back into the playoff chase than to go out there and win? But we'll see how this plays out. But glad to see that this guy's back out there. Now, this brings me to the next story here. This is one that's kind of made its rounds over the last week or so. And this was about Kroger possibly going to Joe Gibbs Racing. But news now that Ricky Stenhouse re-signed with JTG Doherty. And there was a lot of speculation last week that maybe, this team was going to fall away, what it was going to do if they lost this sponsorship. And there's nothing said, set in stone yet. But obviously a possibility right there. But either way, looks like these two are going to be together for a long while, multi-year contract. So it's going to be interesting to follow this and see what happens going into 2025. Now, the other topic this week that just come out is the RCR camp. Once again, going for those supercar drivers to get behind the wheel. This time it's going to be happening at Sonoma. Let's just say apparently. At the time of taping this anyways, apparently. But obviously, Brody Kostecki getting in the car last year at Indy, the 33 for RCR, and unfortunately things fell apart for them. Brody and sponsorship and different things all just crumbled, and along with that, it crumbled ideas that Richard Childress had for this year, and lack of sponsorship. So Mobile X was supposed to be on that car. Richard Childress went to the owner of Mobile X and said, who would you want to see in that car if you don't want Kostecki in there? And he said Will Brown. So Will Brown is getting in that car, apparently once again at Sonoma, to run the Mobile X number 33 for RCR. And this is not the first time that these guys have worked together. Brody Kostecki was also supposed to be working with them at COTA for the World Racing League Finals. And that didn't happen. Brody had to go have some surgery, had his tonsils out. And Will Brown jumped in there and joined the pairing of Kyle Busch and Austin Dillon at COTA. And so they're not new to each other. It's going to be interesting to see what happens with this. This will be the 4th driver from the Supercar Series to come here. And this dude's off to a wild season already. Got like 3 wins. I don't think he's finished outside the top 2 all season. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens with this. Now, let's move on to that big subject. NASCAR Consolation races. Now, this is something that was in the history of NASCAR. And this past week, with the announcement of Tyler Reddick going to be running the paint scheme of Tim Richmond in the 1982 Consolation race for the Daytona 500. That's right, the Consolation race. It was, at that time, Tim failed to qualify for the race, so they had a 30-lap race for people who did not make the field. And this is where this paint scheme comes from. It's pretty wild. The history of the Consolation race is pretty wild. It actually started out in 1959. From 1959 to 1962 at Daytona, they ran these races, except back then, these were actually last chance qualifiers and had a lot of cars in them. 1959, 1960, there was 20 cars in the field. And then in 1961, there was 17 cars in this field. And that race was won by Junior Johnson, which is wild because the previous year in 1960, Junior won the Daytona 500. And now he's out there having to run this race here and was able to make it into the 500. I think he finished 47th in the race. So, man, you won't hear them numbers anymore. But just interesting. And then in 1962, they had the biggest number of cars for the race. That was 21 cars entered that race. And then it took a break until 1981, and it came back at Daytona. And this is really cool to me right here. The very first year, 12 cars in the race. And guess who wins this race? Lake Speed. And not only did he win it, he led every single lap of this race. So I think that's really, really cool right there. Man, I love that old paint scheme right there. I saw that car personally first time, 1981 at North Wilkesboro. And it was wildly different, but it was also attractive in its own way. So really neat story there. And then, of course, 1982, Tim Richmond fails to make the Daytona 500, got out there with 14 cars and was able to take the victory in that race. And this is another story I love right here. 1983, 14 cars enter this race, and Blackie Wangerin wins this race. And, it's got to be so cool to know you won a race like that, even if it was a consolation race, but he still won at Daytona. And that's cool. Man, you gotta look at this right here. Somebody found one of his cars here recently in a garage. This was like after 26 years of sitting. And, man, got to be some interesting stories with that. But that brings us to 1984. There was 25 cars entered this race in 1984. And 1984 was a really, really wild year in so many ways at Daytona. Obviously, Ricky Rudd having that massive flip in the Busch Clash. And then on qualifying, Randy LaJoie getting into the wall, and such a wild, disastrous wreck with that. But then it brings us to the consolation race, and almost the exact same spot, if not the exact same spot. This happens right here, and man, this is just a wild, wild crash that it's just actually hard to believe. This was Nats Peters coming off the wall, and Jim Hurlburt not seeing him in time enough to get slowed. Man, what a massive wreck this was right there. Both of them receiving all kinds of burns to their face and I believe their hands and stuff. And just a wild, wild crash with that. But what's ironic about this, 1985, 9 cars got in this race. And Randy LaJoie, after going through that the previous year out there in qualifying, failed to make the race, but won this race right here. And another interesting tidbit, Glenn Jarrett, Dale Jarrett's brother, finished second in that race. But anyways, hope everybody out there is having a great week. Hope you're off to a great weekend right now. And, man, enjoy the racing. As always, we'll see you at the checkered flag.